beautiful Saturday morning here in Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge, with respect, the Quagan-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Thank you very much. So my name is Michael Abe. I'm project manager for Landscapes of Injustice. So thank you very much for coming out to IdeaFest. I'm going to talk a little bit about our project, and I'll use our 5 W's, 1H. It's been a long time since I've been in school, so if I don't get it quite right, sorry about that. So what is Landscapes? What is it about? Another what? Who are we? What is our research collective? And what's been happening in the first 4 years? And why study this? So this is what we'll go through. I'll go through about 15 minutes briefly, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Jordan Stanger-Ross, and he'll be giving you a more formal lecture. And after that, about 11:15, we'll take a break. We'll go out. There'll be coffee, tea, and some cookies and snacks. And we invite you to look around at our pop-up museum. And we also have some of our research assistants, our RAs as well. So what is Landscapes? It's a partnership. It's a partnership project funded by SSHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also 16 partner organizations. Our project office is here at University of Victoria at the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, and it originates out of the Department of History. We also have museums involved. The Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, the Royal BC Museum here in Victoria, and in Halifax, the Canadian Museum of Immigration, Pier 21. And we also have, in addition to the University of Victoria, we have University of Winnipeg and Ryerson, where our oral history research cluster is located, University of Alberta with legal history, and at Simon Fraser University, where we have scholars there in geography. It's also not only academic, but it's a unique partnership in that it involves our community, the Japanese Canadian community across Canada. And we're very proud to have partners in the community, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, who spearheaded the redress movement in 1980, leading up to the redress in 1988. We also have the Japanese Canadian Cultural Society in Toronto, and there'll also be a venue in addition to the 3 museums when we have our traveling museum exhibit in the second half. And we're also pleased to have on board is the Vancouver Japanese Language School and Japanese Hall, and that was the only property in the Powell Street area that was not dispossessed during the 1940s. We have some historical associations as well, and our latest partner to come on board is the Library and Archives of Canada, very important partner. I'll allude to in a moment why. So that's what is Landscapes and what is it about. So I'm going to try and condense this 7-year project into 60 seconds. So you may have seen this. This was a promo for today's event. So that, in a nutshell, is the focus of our project. There's been a lot written about the internment and incarceration of Japanese Canadians, but really not so much about the dispossession and forced sale. So we're researching the history of that. We're doing that in 4 main study sites, 23 block area of Powell Street, Haney, the Maple Ridge area, where the farms were sold to the Veterans Land Act for returning soldiers. Steveston, because the important fishing industry that was there and exists now. And Salt Spring Island, 11 properties were sold there, forcibly sold. The largest, the Iwasaki property, 585 acres, it sold against his will for $5,000. And we've got over 100,000 pages digitized. That includes land titles of the properties in these study sites, also maps, fire insurance maps, and then mapping the evolution of these communities. We also have 1,480 bird commission files, documented, digitized, and as I mentioned, the Library Archives of Canada, they have committed to us to digitize all 15,000 case files of the Japanese Canadian families that were interned. And we recently uncovered or discovered 300 letters of protest. In that short video, that's my mother's cousin. He lived up in Mr. Takarabe. He lived up in Crofton. And you can see that his letters he's writing are very strong, and you can just feel the injustice that he's been feeling. And it's also interesting that he was writing and it was sold in 1948, quite a bit after the war had ended. And oral histories, our oral history cluster at Ryerson, they've collected over 100 new oral histories, not only of the Japanese Canadians, but also bystanders, witnesses. These are like descendants of bureaucrats and politicians who were instrumental in the policies of the forced dispossession. So about 60 or 70 people working in our research collective. They're from all across Canada. They include academics, they include museum professionals, classroom teachers, and community leaders, as I mentioned. It's also a community project. So we have a lot of people on the ground, great minds. The brainchild behind this is Dr. George Stanger-Ross. Also at University of Victoria in the Geography Department, heading up the Historical GIS, is Dr. Ruben Rose Redwood. Eric Adams at the University of Alberta, he's heading up the Legal History Cluster. The Oral History is at Ryerson University with Pamela Sugaman, who's Dean of Arts there. You may know Audrey Kobayashi at Queen's University. She was very instrumental during the Free US movement, very key person in our community. Sherry Kajiwara, she's the director curator at the Nikkei National Museum. And Mike and Greg, they head up our teacher resources cluster. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Mike does the secondary school and Greg does the elementary school curriculum. I talked about the community involvement. This is our community council. They're in the process of adding 2 more from the east. So they are our sounding board. They make sure that our project is moving forward in concert with the thinkings of the community. You can see our chair is Vivian Remistad, and also Art Meeke is on our community council. He was the one that signed the redress in 1988, September 22nd, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. And students, we've hired over 50 students over the 4 years so far, and probably in student years over 110. Many of them are doing 2, even 3 years staying with our project. They do the research, they analyze, they write, they present, they do everything that our project does. And I'm very happy to welcome 3 of our RAs today who will be involved in our museum exhibit. We've got Alyssa Cartwright, Alyssa, at the back there. She worked for 2 years, the first 2 years of the project, and then she went off to Dublin, Ireland to do her master's in philosophy. And she's back in Victoria as a legal assistant. And she worked on the fishing boat ledgers, so she has a poster up there and she can talk to that during our pop-up museum exhibit time afterwards. We've got Cindy Furman. Is she here? She's at the back. She's at the back. And she worked this summer at the Provincial Records Cluster at BC Archives, along with some of our other RAs. And she's put together, we talked about the letters of protest. She's put together a little display of those letters of protest. Very interested to see the language that the Japanese Canadians used, and what kind of response the form letters that were sent in return. So we have some examples up there. And we also have Camille Hassel. And she's currently an undergrad in history, and you appear a number of times up there. She was involved in the student podcast. She did a podcast from last year's community engaged course here at the University of Victoria, and she worked in the provincial records cluster with Sydney and Gordon and Tess, and so she has a poster about some of her research. And some of the letters are quite interesting in there, some of the correspondence between some of the bureaucrats who are involved in the dispossession. So please visit them, grab a coffee afterwards and a cookie, and go talk to our RAs. We've also had over about 40 plus publications either completed or on their way. This one, Suspect Properties by Dr. Stanger-Ross, looked at the involvement of the city of Vancouver deeming, just in 1942-ish, deeming some of the properties in the Powell Street, condemning them and sort of declaring of the slum, and that was motivated the dispossession of Japanese Canadians on a larger scale. I believe we talked about that there. Ruben Rose Redwood, he's put an article out on GIS, that's what we talked about, geographic information systems, so it's mapping the areas and analyzing and collecting, making a map of the area and then inputting the data that we collect. Promises of Law in the Osgood Hall Law School, again Dr. Stanger-Ross along with Dr. Adams from the University of Alberta. And we've had some publications already. Two books came out last fall. Witness to Loss. It's based on the memoirs of Kishizo Kimura, and who was a prominent businessman in Vancouver, Powell Street, and he was the Japanese Canadian representative on the committee, first for the selling of the fishing boats, and then later for the selling of the land and property. As the properties went on sale, he did step down, and years later he wrote these memoirs in Japanese to his children, and those were donated to the Nikkei National Museum. Dr. Stanger-Ross had them translated, and they are now published in this book that is edited by Gordon Stanger-Ross and Pamela Sugarman. And you also have commentaries by other academics and also community members like Masako Fukawa. We do have a few copies outside. We have a specially bid price, $25. But the other publication I wanted to talk about was The Tree Trunk Can Be My Pillow. It was a manuscript that was worked on by Dr. Kagetsu, the son of Eikichi Kagetsu. Eikichi Kagetsu was probably the wealthiest Japanese Canadian before the war. He had Deep Bay Logging Company up just south of Comox here on the island. He founded Fanny Bay Oysters, but he had this huge enterprise, logging enterprise, and it was sold. During the museum exhibit, we have a poster by one of our RAs, Nicole Yakashiro, and she analyzes the value, what he placed on his property if he were to sell, and what it was assessed for, and what it was sold for. And you can see what the gap is, and take a look at that poster. And we also have at the same booth, a short video by Kiyoshi McGuire, who interviewed Trevor Wyman, one of our research assistants, who was working on his Kagetsu file. And we also have some footage of the actual logging camp from the 1930s and 40s. So take a look at that during the museum exhibit. And you can get that book. The hard copies are all, the first print's almost out of, it's almost sold out, but you can get the PDF online, go through University of Victoria Press. You just Google University of Victoria Press, Kagetsu, and you will find it. And we've got a lot of public conversation about this. We've got op-eds. we've had over 35 media interviews, television interviews, and even in the bottom right-hand corner, NHK, like Japanese CBC, they were over here and they produced 2 10-minute news pieces for broadcast in December in Japan. So phase 1 was from 2014 to this April, and then from April we start on our second phase, which is to disseminate the research findings to the general public, and we have a number of strategies. I'll talk about that. But more importantly, for the Japanese Canadian community and researchers, all of our research will be put online in a more user-friendly database. Then you'll be able to look at researcher family history a lot easier, going through the Library Archives of Canada. The first one I mentioned is the museum exhibit. So they're developing the Nikkei National Museum and Royal BC Museum will be curating and producing a museum exhibit that will travel across Canada. I mentioned the 4 venues earlier. Public history website. This will be a digital platform where all our research will be presented in a more innovative and engaging fashion online. Archival website, as I mentioned, this is something that by the end of our project, all of our research will be housed there. And for Japanese Canadian, if you want to look at if we can find some files for you beforehand, we can help you out with that. So if you've got Japanese Canadian heritage and you want to learn a little bit more about your family, just contact us. And the other one is teacher resources. So we're trying to create modules and teaching curricula that will be more easily assimilated and used in the school system, both here provincially and then nationally. Both in secondary school, and this is Michael Abe Whittingham. We'll be using our materials, our resources, our primary research materials to incorporate into high school curricula. And they are just working on that now for final piloting through 2019 with a rollout 2019-2020 near the end of our project. But what's exciting right now is our elementary school. I'll just go very briefly through this. Greg Miyanaga, he's developed this module for grade 5, and he has some fellow teachers testing this already, piloting it in their classrooms. I think your sister also in Ontario piloted it. So it's using our materials to teach children, 10-year-olds, about dispossession. They use 3 kinds of engagement: hands-on, which is doing something with their hands so that they learn a little bit, makes it more real. Minds-on, it develops critical thinking, it stimulates their curiosity. And hearts-on, when they do this, they really bring it into themselves. They get it through this emotional lens, and they get a deeper understanding and a greater level of engagement. So what they do is they get a property card based on, in this case, Powell Street. They're a family. Each person is a family. They have a residence above their business, and they just interact with each other over the weeks, as any community would. They become very attached to the work. But then after a bit of time, these events occur: Pearl Harbor, the evacuation order, and so they go home on Friday, and this is what their community looks like, that they worked on for several weeks or months. And then they come back on Monday, and all of their people have moved over to another part of the room, just the people and some of the possessions. And interesting enough, their other possessions start to diminish as they get sold off to pay for their own internment. So needless to say, the students, what are their reactions? They're obviously very upset to have their, not only their people moved, but also their possessions removed without their permission. And so this really brings it more, they're able to talk about this with more feeling and understand it and bring it. This is what that hearts-on learning is. So a good example of that is this was done in Coquitlam, and one of the students, the 10-year-olds, she talked her parents into driving her down to the downtown east side to get a picture in front of her building. So here she is. photographer, but so that in a nutshell, I think I went over about 2 minutes of my time, but without any further ado, I do want to give this stage over to Dr. George Stanger-Ross and his presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for coming out, and it's my pleasure to talk about some of the research that we're doing on landscapes of injustice today. So as you'll have realized from Mike's presentation in 1942, as many of you know, and came here for this reason, the Canadian government uprooted and interned some 22,000 Japanese Canadians living in coastal British Columbia, about 95% of the Japanese Canadian population, living within 100 miles of the coast, not exactly coastal in the sense of ocean views, but a large swath of western British Columbia. And then the Canadian government seized and sold all of the property of Japanese Canadians. So when Japanese Canadians like this family made decisions about what to take with them to their internment, they did so with the assurance that the rest of their property would be protected and returned to them when possible. And they made difficult choices about what to take. Instead of protecting and preserving that property, the Canadian government sold all of it without their consent. This meant that in 1949, when Japanese Canadians were finally permitted to return to coastal British Columbia, and that date's important, 1949. Most of the internment era was after the Second World War. So that period of time was longer than the wartime internment of Japanese Canadians. In 1949, when Japanese Canadians were finally able to return home to the coast, everything was gone. They had nothing to return to. Our project, Landscapes of Injustice, is devoted to the dispossession, its origins, its consequences, and its history since then. Our work and you've seen there's a lot of people working on this together, and those people share a number of convictions, or core convictions. A conviction that this is a history that all Canadians should know. That it's a story about the violation of human and civil rights at a time of perceived insecurity, about measures taken in the name of national defense that made no one safer, about the enduring harms of mass displacement and the loss of home, and about the resilience of people confronting injustice. In our research collective, we share the conviction that this is a story for our times, and indeed it feels like it's becoming more salient over the course of this project. We started working on this in 2012. Spent 2 years in application and a 2-phase process, and we're funded in 2014. The project will run until 2021, and we've been feeling this project increasingly relevant over time. But how widely shared is this conviction? I want to raise this question by returning to my first day on the job, or what I like to call my first day on the job. So the project was funded in June 2014. We started to get up and running and hiring some students and beginning our research. And on August 28, 2014, at 11:30 a.m., I had my first experience like this of bringing this project to a public audience. I was not prepared. I was not well prepared for what would follow. So you'll join me in revisiting that moment.
Bringing you deeper into the story. Pamela McCall on CFAX 1070.
Welcome back. The forced dispossession of Japanese Canadians, the focus of a 7-year research project led by UVic. It's called Landscapes of Injustice. My guest is Jordan Stanger-Ross, project director. Let's get to the phones now. Let's get to Anne. Hi, Anne. You're on CFAX 1070. Thanks for calling.
Hi. This is a really interesting discussion. Yeah, the fear here. I mean, I wasn't around in those days, but I have family members who were, and the Japanese fishing boats were coming all around Victoria, and there was absolute panic that they were actually going to come up, on the island and take us over, and being cut off from the mainland, it was pretty scary. I had one relative who organized the militia out in central Saanich, and they were, in fact, going to take to the Souk Hills should this happen and act as guerrilla fighters. Another member of my family, a pilot in the RAF, had one of his men shot down, and one of the commanders poured boiling water down this man's throat until he died. So, you know, folks, I think there was a lot of anger around then, and we can't look back at it and make the right decision. Being cool and saying, oh, well, you know, the federal government didn't do it for these reasons. We don't know. It may not even be written down, but I think there was a lot of let's punish these people for the sheer brutality of what they have done.
That's a lot of emotion in your story. Thanks for sharing, Anne. Jordan, quite a picture that Anne paints there.
Yeah. So I was not anticipating that. I got a number of calls like that. Maybe some people in the room would have anticipated that. I didn't. It sort of felt like we had dialed 1942. Hello, 1942. What do you have to say? You know. And so I made a response at the time, and I'll come back to the response a little later in the talk. I'm pretty happy. I was shell-shocked at the time. I didn't know what I had done, and I listened to it afterwards, and I was pretty happy with my response. But I've actually reflected on that exchange more than any media appearance that I've ever done, or more than any engagement with the public that I've ever had. And I want to use it. I want to use that exchange to organize some of my thoughts that I'm going to present today. So I think Anne makes kind of 2 points, or there are 2 points in Anne. I don't know if Anne from Victoria is here, but in Anne from Victoria's comments, I've thought mostly about 2 points. So one of the points she makes is you can't look back. You weren't there. We don't know what people were thinking. We can't understand their motivations. The past is something that we, from which we're barred from any real understanding. And then perhaps somewhat contradictorily, she makes a second point, which is that we should understand the internment of Japanese Canadians in the context of the war in the Pacific, and in the context of the very brutal events of the 1940s, of the real fear that Canadians felt in Pacific Canada, and that in that context, the uprooting and internment is, if not justifiable, at least understandable. So I think she makes these two points, and I want to take them up each in turn. So you can't look back, or at least you shouldn't. Now, Anne from Victoria makes this point in a way that I find not highly sympathetic, because she embeds it in a kind of fictionalized past that she tells. But, in fact, she's not alone in making this argument that we can't look back or shouldn't look back on histories of injustice, that in dredging up these kinds of pasts and seeking to interpret them from our present perspectives, we do more harm than good. And in fact, a scholar who I found very interesting, a former journalist in Eastern Europe, made a very similar argument in a book that I find quite compelling and interesting, a fellow by the name of David Reeve, who wrote a book in praise of forgetting, in which, like Anne from Victoria, he praises forgetting. You can't look back, you shouldn't look back. Reeve's argument unfolds over several chapters, but is in some senses summed up in this question that he poses: what if collective memory, national collective memory, is not just widely overrated as a measure of a society's coherence, which is an argument he makes, and not just ultimately futile, another argument he makes, but often actually dangerous, which is the ultimate point of the book. So Reeve is arguing that there's this notion that if we remember the past, if we revisit our histories, revisit our difficult histories, it improves us as a nation, as a people. It improves. We can somehow improve our relations with one another. He says he doesn't see evidence of this. He certainly didn't see evidence of it in Eastern Europe when he was a journalist there. It's a futile attempt. Reeve's argument is we do violence to the past when we remember it. We remember it badly. We remember it selectively. We remember it in service of our own present aims. So whenever we're told never to forget, it's a futile gesture. In fact, we always forget. Even our acts of remembering are also acts of forgetting. And finally, his point is not only can we not do it, and do we do it badly, but it's actually harmful when we do so. We often find cause for further dispute in revisiting these pasts of harm. And I think in some ways, Anne from Victoria is making a similar argument, that she feels attacked, so that she feels her family attacked in this revisiting of this past. She feels we do it badly, and it doesn't help us to do this kind of remembering. But in fact, Anne from Victoria is telling history. In fact, she's not forgetting. She's telling a story about the past based on this kind of evidence that is highly fictionalized, but evidence that she's received within her family, apparently. So she tells us a story about the past. She tells us a story about belonging, about who was a Canadian in 1942, and who was under threat at that time, and who needed protection from who deserved what from whom at that moment. She tells us a story about the past that is also a story about the natural consequences of fear, of security, of really fearing for your security. And linked to that, she tells a story about the past that involves describing the inevitable limits of human and civil rights, that we should understand that at times of crisis, societies take measures that from later perspectives might seem to have been misguided, but that's the way human societies operate. When we're under threat, we sometimes compromise other values, and we're justified in doing so. And I think Anne's story matters today. If we accept that story about the past, I think that matters. I think we will confront those kinds of questions. What role do human and civil rights play in contexts of perceived national insecurity? What compromises need to be made? And Anne has a story to tell, an historical story, in answer to those questions. When I think back on that exchange, I'm reminded that historians won't decide, in fact, whether the past is remembered or forgotten. Dave Reef can write his book, but it's not actually going to cause anyone to forget. Instead, these stories will be told with or without us, stories about the past that are of consequence today. So our choice, and my choice as an historian, is not whether or not this history of British Columbia will be remembered or forgotten in various ways, or rather whether I'm going to intervene in those or attempt to intervene in various ways in those discussions, along with others, and how. I'm reminded when I think about Anne of a speech very much along this line that Carl Becker gave when he was president of the American Historical Association, the largest and most important association of historians in the world. And this speech that he gave in 1931 is the most often cited, best remembered presidential address in the history of the American Historical Association, in which he told his colleagues that they would ignore those other histories, those histories told outside of the academy, those histories of remembered events, that they would ignore those at their peril. That if historians ignored those, their books would grow dusty on bookshelves, while history that really mattered happened in the world. Becker said, the history that does work in the world, the history that influences the course of history, is living history. That pattern of remembered events, whether true or false, that enlarges and enriches the collective specious present. He was born philosophically from this notion that the present is this fleeting, right? Where did the present go, right? What we have is a past out of which we build ideas, a future to which we aspire, and that stories about the past play a critical role in how our society actually operates, and that historians should care about that, should be involved in it. And that same notion was taken up recently in one of those presidential addresses that cited Becker when Bill Cronin, a wonderful environmental historian in Wisconsin, urged his peers again to keep telling stories that matter as much to our students and to the public as they do to us. So Anne and Victoria, it makes me think of Becker and of Cronin, and reminds me that stories of the BC's past will be told with or without historians like myself. And with or without this history of Japanese-Canadian dispossession, it can be left in or out of histories of British Columbia about what matters in the history of this place. And I do believe that such stories are of consequence. In answer to that first point of Anne's, I think we can tell stories of the past. We must tell stories of the past. And I think even Anne is telling stories of the past. And so we're doing so on this project in various ways. As Mike has already pointed out, we have this book, an academic book. We have many students working on this project and doing research and writing theses. There's Gregor Craigie, I don't know if he's recognizable here, interviewing elders of the Japanese-Canadian community in a public event that we held here at UVic. We're in media, we're on Facebook, and yeah, we're in the classrooms. And I don't know how those teachers get away with stealing the possessions of the students without just causing a revolt in their classrooms, but apparently they know what they're doing and they're able to teach history through that. So what are we saying as we intervene in these discussions? What kinds of arguments is the project actually making? Well, I want to return to Anne's second point in answer to that question. So Anne says that what was going on was a punishment or a response, maybe a crisis response, this sheer brutality of what they were doing, of what the Japanese were doing. So let's see how I answered that claim at the time.
Jordan, quite a picture that Anne paints there.
Mm-hmm.
People were scared.
Well, it's very important to distinguish, as many Canadians at the time, including government officials, did, and we shouldn't forget this distinction, between the nation of Japan and Japanese Canadians living here, many of them for multiple generations by the time of the outbreak of the war. The large majority of the people who were affected by this policy were Canadians. They were naturalized British subjects of Canada. They weren't Japanese. They were Canadians. And the fishing boats, one of the very first things that occurred after Pearl Harbor was the impounding of Japanese-Canadian fishing vessels. Japanese-Canadians cooperated with that process. They brought their fishing vessels to Canadian authorities. There was certainly no effort by Japanese-Canadians to threaten any area of Canada using their fishing boats. So any recollection that would suggest that.
But what do you say to the people that say, easy for us to say, now we're examining this, at this juncture when we're all safe. But, Pearl Harbor was a game changer. People were scared, and we react in different ways when fear's coursing through our veins.
So I think not a bad answer that I gave, but also totally unsuccessful, right? Michael Abe asked the same question essentially immediately thereafter. So I thought a little bit about what I was trying to do and what we try to do on the project, and I think in that answer, although I hadn't thought it through and I was very much flustered, I think I tried to do two separate things in my answer. One is to clarify terms. I think I tried to clarify the language in which we were discussing this history. And second, I tried to introduce some alternative evidence to the stories that Anne and Victoria was telling. And I think those are two key dimensions of what scholars in partnership with museums and teachers and so on can do in intervening in the discussion of these events. So in the area of clarifying terms, terms like Canadian. Who was a Canadian? What does Canadian mean in 1942? Who was Japanese? What does Japanese mean in 1942? How should we understand these Japanese Canadians? And so the point that I made in that interview, and more complex terms can be more complex analysis can be made of Japanese Canadian lives. But one important dimension is to understand how long Japanese Canadians have been living here, and how indeed they lived in multi-generational, long-standing Canadian communities. British Columbia at this time is a place awash with newcomers. 2/3 of the population isn't born here. But 75% of Japanese Canadians are Canadians, in fact, 50% of them born here. Lots of young Japanese Canadians are uprooted and interned. They've been working in core industries in British Columbia for generations, including first in the fishing industry, as many of you will know. They've established urban neighborhoods, especially in Vancouver's Powell Street neighborhood, but also elsewhere, and have long-standing businesses. They're farmers and also here foragers for some of the beautiful produce of British Columbia. As Mike mentioned, Akichi Kagetsu is a major business person. He's a representative of Canada in 1936 in the delegation that goes to Vimy Ridge. 6 years later, he loses everything that he built up here. He's an employer of Japanese Canadians and non-Japanese Canadians at his mill. Japanese Canadians have established associations and language schools and all the kinds of things that long-standing immigrant communities in a place like Canada will do. So that's one of the first points that I try to, that's one of the first thing I try to do in that exchange on the radio is to clarify terms. Well, let's think carefully. Are these Japanese fishers encircling Canadians on Vancouver Island, or should we be exploring this history in different terms from that? What are the best categories and terms to use when we ask hard questions about the Canadian past? And then the second thing I do is try to introduce some alternative evidence to the evidence that Anne introduces, right? So those stories that she tells are not true, and I try to use evidence to tell an alternative history. But whenever this question comes up, I think, when we talk about the internment of Japanese Canadians and the injustice of dispossession, I think even people who don't have fictionalized histories like Anne will ask this question. Well, wasn't this a reasonable response in the context of fear in Pacific Canada at a time of war? I think that question comes up in a lot of contexts. A lot of people wonder that. One way to start answering that is to remember the apology in 1988 by Brian Mulrooney, and this was in the written text of the acknowledgement. And if we read it carefully, I think we see something interesting here. In retrospect, government policies of disenfranchisement, and I'm going to do this with my fingers, disenfranchisement, detention, confiscation and sale of private and community property. It's not good to be holding a clicker while you do this. Deportation and restriction of movement, which continued after the war. I count 9 policies there. Right? 9 policies. And that's an important key to getting into this history. The internment era unfolded slowly over a long period of time. This wasn't just a momentary reaction to fear at the outbreak of war. This was a decade of Canadian policy. I want to point to 3 policies that are important to remember when we think about this question. Was this justified in a time of war? One is the dispossession of property, the core focus of our project, which the wholesale liquidation or sale of Japanese Canadian-owned property began in 1943, really got underway in 1944, continued into the 1950s. In 1944, as Japanese Canadian properties were selling at an increased rate here in BC, the Prime Minister stood in the House of Commons and told Canadians that the war was over, that victory was assured, it was just a matter of when. The continuation of the internment to 1949. This is another set of policy decisions, actually made up of many, many small administrative decisions. Decisions made after the war to extend those powers. Was this made in the context of a panic in 1941, 1942? And then the exile, the attempted exile of 50% of the pre-war coastal population, 10,000 people, and the actual exile of 20% of that population in 1946, after the guns of war had gone silent. As a point of contrast, consider that in the United States, they exiled or deported approximately 1% of the coastal pre-war population. In Canada, we deported 20%. Was that decision in 1946 made in a moment of panic about Japanese fishermen surrounding Victoria? Each one of these decisions, and actually there are many, many more, were actually comprised of the bureaucratic, comprised by the bureaucratic and political administration of Japanese Canadian lives over the course of a decade. And they were made in long conversations that comprised thousands of pages of government records. They're not a momentary or single decision. That's not the policy that we live with, or the history that we live with. The focus of our project, of course, is the dispossession of property. And there were strict limits placed on what Japanese Canadians could take with them to internment. So a family like this would have made hard choices about what was in their luggage. Oftentimes, as appears in the case in this family, the father or husband in the family had already been uprooted and interned. So they're making this choice under very constrained circumstances, and with the assurance that the rest would be returned to them. Of course, the rest was not returned to them. Instead, it was all sold. Over 1,000 fishing vessels were sold. Hundreds of automobiles were sold in the summer of 1942. Businesses and homes were sold. This was a public process that unfolded involving hundreds, thousands of Japanese Canadians. Here are public listings of Japanese Canadian real estate for sale in Vancouver, each with a real estate company offering that property for public sale. There were notices in newspapers, signs outside of houses, announcements and articles on Canadian veterans receiving Japanese Canadian land. There were auctions, including this pre-Christmas everything must go auctions. Hundreds, thousands of British Columbians participated in this process, and there was scarcely any objection as this process unfolded.
What's the date on that?
I'd have to double check the date on that. It's probably 43, it looks like. 43, but we have dozens and dozens of these auction announcements. This person doesn't look panicked to me. Here's the new owner of a store in Vancouver. There's also a Chinese Canadian pictured indicating that, that he's not Japanese Canadian. So is the best perspective from which to understand this history a moment of panic in response to Pearl Harbor? Or should we be thinking, does the evidence compel us to think about this history quite differently? I'd argue that there was, in fact, a moment of perceived crisis in December 1941, early 1942. There was a moment of panic. In 1941-42, one of the places that I looked at this is an easy place for anyone here to look at. It's the diaries of the Prime Minister, William Mackenzie King. In 1941 and 1942, King, where you'll also find very racist statements on his part about Japanese Canadians, but in 41-42, in that new year, King seems genuinely panicked in his diary. He's talking about a crisis of Western civilization. He's concerned about the security of Pacific Canada. So around the moment of internment, we can have a debate. We can have, I think, a reasonable debate about what role security concerns played, even if they were ill-founded security concerns, and even if the actions still didn't make anyone safer. We can talk about that moment of crisis and what happens. And I think that's an important conversation to have. In 1943, on the date when they decided to force the sale of all Japanese Canadian-owned property, just over a year later, but a lot had changed in the war, a lot had changed in what the perceived security of the Pacific Coast. In January 1943, when they decided to sell all of Japanese Canadian-owned property, if you go to King's diary, he's speculating about, or he's forecasting, the number of years he would have to remain Prime Minister in order to be the longest-serving parliamentarian in Canadian history. That's what's of concern to King in January 1943. He's not right. He doesn't write anything about the forced sale of Japanese Canadian property. It's not undertaken in relation to some crisis in federal cabinet around the security of the Pacific Coast. In 1944, when most of the property sold, there simply was no crisis on the West Coast. In 1946, when 4,000 Japanese Canadians were deported, there was no crisis. In 1949, as the internment lingered on, the Americans had disbanded their camps in 1945. The Canadians kept theirs to 1949. There was no crisis. So the war context itself was dynamic, and the internment era extends beyond the wartime. The internment's not one thing. It's not one moment of crisis. It's a policy that unfolds over time. So when we go to the evidence, we confront realities like this, and one of the roles of our project in a wide range of ways is to bring these forms of evidence forward and to engage them. And one form of evidence that we find, contrary to Anne's speculation, is in fact what they were thinking. You know, we can know at least what they say they were thinking, and we have a lot of information, for example, on this fellow, Glenn McPherson, whose daughter's been interviewed by our project, and we have a great deal of information. He's the bureaucrat most responsible for the forced sale of Japanese-Canadian-owned property, and we can actually know a lot about what he was thinking at that time and explore it and attempt to communicate that. Try to understand what the bureaucrats and politicians were actually thinking as they made these decisions. And we can also find other forms of evidence in the archives. And I'm going to end with one of these letters. You can read more of them outside. I'm going to end with a piece of evidence that we find in the archives. This is a transcribed version of a letter sent in protest by a former resident of Haney, BC, who you can see here pictured with his family, Rikizo Yonoyama. And this is what he wrote on July 31st, 1944, and I'll let him close this talk. He was living in Edmonton at the time. He wrote, "During May of this year, I received notification that my property at Haney, BC had been sold for a sum of $1,406.98. My property there consisted of 17.5 acres of land and other household goods, of which I am enclosing a list, which I valued at a sum of $4,500. The custodian has not at any time requested my sanction to dispose of my property, and had he done so, I would have been most reluctant to sell it. Through hard work, I have been successful in making an income of approximately $3,500 per year, which I expended to put my 2 children through university as a doctor and dentist, respectively. In order that my 2 remaining children, who are dependent upon me, receive the same privilege as their 2 older sisters, it was my desire to return to my home in Haney and endeavor, as in the past, to obtain sufficient independence to enable them to complete their education. I came to Canada in 1907 and was allowed the privilege of Canadian citizenship on December 22nd, 1914. This, to me, was the most gracious opportunity given by the country of my adoption. Through it, I realized an ambition I had desired since landing on this continent, that of being able to raise a family of Canadian sons and daughters. It does not seem just that as Canadians, my family should be deprived of a home which to us meant more than just a home. It was to us the foundation of security and freedom as Canadian citizens." Thank you. I open the floor for some questions. We'll spend, I guess, 15 minutes on questions, and then we'll let you free to grab a coffee. I'll still be there. We can ask questions in that period also. Go ahead, sir.
At least part of the reason for the internment dispossession must have been that Canada feared that the Japanese Canadian community would engage in activities that would further the interests of the Japanese border. Has there ever been any evidence of activity by the Japanese Canadians that helped Japan in the war?
No, there's never been any evidence, and the Prime Minister, even during the war, in that same 1944 speech in the House where he explained that the war was over and he outlined intended policy with regards to Japanese Canadians, he acknowledged in that speech that there had never been any evidence found of any act of sabotage or any act that would any act of disloyalty. The motives in all of this were highly varied, and one thing is that the policy extended over time, and another thing is that it involved a lot of people. So we can think of it as kind of extending vertically, if you want, over time and horizontally. And when we start to look carefully at what were the motives of the people involved. We actually find a lot of people involved, and we find a wide range of different motives. So the motives of someone like Leonard Ferguson, who was responsible for the forced sale of property, really his purview was very limited. He was executive director essentially of an area of government, an area of the bureaucracy that had invested with control of property, and that was his concern. His decision to force the sale of property emerged out of particular concerns within his department. The exile of Japanese Canadians in 1946, similarly, there's a few areas of the bureaucracy involved, and some of them are basically bureaucrats responsible for the camps. And they confront this problem. The war's ending. It's politically, their political masters are telling them that Japanese Canadians can't return to British Columbia. So what are they going to do? And one of their solutions is to exile as many people as possible. So we get. But then there are some people who are whose motives. The cabinet member from BC, Ian Mackenzie, is made it a long-standing political promise of his to his constituencies to rid the province of British Columbia of Japanese Canadians. So you get a range of different motives as you move across there. Certainly, I would say though I don't think that scarcely anyone involved in the process took seriously the notion that Japanese Canadians themselves posed a security risk. And if, even in that initial policy, and certainly that played no role in, for example, forcing the sale of homes that have been rented for a year since Japanese Canadians had been forced from the coast. I'll go just for room equity. I'll come back to you in a second, but let's go all the way to the back, the woman with the red glasses and white sweater. Yeah.
Thank you. I wondered if your evidence has uncovered any views of Canadians who were against this, who understood that this was an injustice at the time, and I'm thinking of the people who were the neighbors of these Japanese people, or who were the Japanese Canadians were their employers.
So certainly yes. I read, when I was trying to understand Kishizo Kimura and his collaboration with the process, I read Hannah Arendt's works. I was trying to understand collaborators. She said of terror generally, she makes this argument that the lesson of political terror is that most of us will accept it or concede to it, but that some of us won't. And we find those some of us who won't in this history as well. So some within the federal government object vociferously to the policies, and they end up marginalized essentially, but there are strong objections that come from within government. And then there are some remarkable stories on kind of a grassroots level, like you said, in the area where Young live. Our project has now, I think, interviewed a family where in 1942, when they left, they sold their farm to their neighbor for $1. And in 1950, when they returned, their neighbor sold it back to them for $1. We do have some kind of amazing instances like that. That's not the general trend, but we do have instances like that. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if Japan actually bombed Canada at one point, or do you have any evidence of that from Japan?
There was one incident, but there was no attempted military invasion. No, but yeah, there was one incident with a U-boat on the coast here, but there was a bombing, of course, of Pearl Harbor, which drew Canada into war, but there was no similar incident on that scale here. Yeah.
So when you said a few minutes ago, do you think that motives, there were no reasons came to the open, that these people were were possessed of their possessions. Why was it done? What was the reason?
For the dispossession? So it's my view that for each of these levels of policy decision, each of these moments, there are different answers. The dispossession of property I've done a lot of work on. And so a lot of people involved operating with different motives. So there were this doesn't happen in the United States, which is a useful contrast. So Japanese Americans are uprooted and interned, but a first major policy difference occurs. The Americans never take responsibility for the property. Many Japanese Americans still lost property, but there's no body of government in the United States that's been vested with or responsible for that property. In Canada, we take a different path. The director of the British Security Commission, British Columbia Security Commission, the BCSC, Austin Taylor, who's this wealthy guy, he receives the draft outline of what the British Columbia Security Commission is going to do. And he said, well, what are you doing about the property? He's a millionaire. He's used to thinking about property. So what are you doing about the property? So in a day, they quickly revise Order in Council 1665 in March of 1942. They quickly revise it, and they say the property will be vested in the custodian and protected, and preserved and protected, something like that, a single line in the Order in Council. So now you have a body of government that's been vested with the property. There's an office of government that's going to now be responsible for this property. They don't even know what property they've invested with. They have an inability to communicate with. They don't have the language skills to communicate with many of the Japanese Canadian owners. And some people in government start saying, what do you mean by protect? What is this going to constitute? And Japanese Canadians start asking, what do you mean by protect? And so in the course of the month, they revised that Order in Council, and a new Order in Council at the end of March that offers pretty robust protection. It articulates that it's all going to be preserved and protected in the interest of the owner and returned to them at the end of the war or at the first moment that it can be done without prejudice to the interests of the owner. So now they've created fairly robust protection in March 1942. So an office gets set up and they start trying to deal with this. Now, meanwhile, there are people in government who don't want to see that protection. They don't want to see that protection actually be meaningful. There are people in government who want to see Japanese Canadians rid forever, and those people start pushing early for the forced sale of all of that property. The lawyers, most of the lawyers who have been entrusted with this managerial responsibility, they're not sure that it's going to be legal to accept those demands. So but meanwhile, they're overwhelmed by the task that's been put to them. They ask for creditors to come forward, and they get 10,000 notes from creditors. They don't even know what property they have. So they're motivated in part by the bureaucratic problems that they face. They have members of cabinet and of parliament who want to see Japanese Canadians out of the province forever. The city of Vancouver starts to intervene by condemning properties in Vancouver that are being rented to tenants. The people in the city of Vancouver have a different set of motives. There are housing reformers there who are hoping that they can clear the whole east end of the city and build new, better housing for workers in east end Vancouver. So they're coming from very different motives. The bureaucrats responsible for the property have the political pressures and they have the arguments coming from the municipal government, and it solves a problem for them. They're struggling to manage this stuff. For them, the kind of combination of the racist positions of cabinet and the interests of housing reforms in Vancouver, it works for them to solve this problem of management that they've inherited. So they start to push for a policy to force the sale of all the property. That effort by bureaucrats kind of winds its way up to cabinet. By January 1943, they pass a new order in council that says that protection includes forced sales. And very shortly thereafter, that office of government starts to set up to force sale all the property. And all of these policy moments are complicated like that. And I think it's useful to remember them in their simple terms. Japanese Canadians had their property stolen, and that's an injustice. That's a simple way to remember it, and it's absolutely true. It's also useful, I think, simultaneously to try and remember it in those complex ways. How does bad law actually happen? How does a bureaucracy actually operate in these contexts to have really harmful outcomes? And so we try on the project, I try not to do so much of that detail that it becomes, that we lose the simple message or that we just lose our audience. At the same time as I think those kind of mechanisms by which these policies actually operate is critical to the story. And in none of that story is panic. No one's panicked about the forced sale of real estate, aside from Japanese Canadians themselves are panicked about the forced sale of real estate.
I was interested in your point on building and collaborative memory. I was just wondering from the Japanese community's perspective, the experience of my family members who were interned, but it wasn't a story that was shared, and the experiences weren't discussed. And I think that was not common after the internment, like passing on the stories to children and stuff, and that was a way to just focus on, how do we get ourselves back, like our lives back, and to be successful. And you're doing that also totally assimilating to the Canadian and Canadian population. So I was wondering how the Landscapes Project can address some of this perhaps problem of a loss of information, like as many people who have been here have already passed away.
Thanks. Well, complicated sets of questions. There's lots of information lost, including those kinds. One of the silences that my colleague and all historians have been interested in is also the silences in non-Japanese Canadian families. There's been more talk of the silence of Japanese Canadians about this than there has been about the silence of the rest of us about this. And both those silences are losses of information, but also they're questions for us to think about the nature of those silences. Our project's interviewed a lot of Japanese Canadians about this. There are about more than 1,000 interviews of Japanese Canadians about the internment era. So we actually have many Japanese Canadian storytellers telling this history. Certainly, I hear that a lot, and our oral historians hear that a lot about this history. But my own experience coming to this project only in 2012, 2014, I've been surrounded by really powerful Japanese Canadian storytellers about this history for the whole time I've been working on it. So I sort of try to put those two realities together. I mean, Mary Kitagawa, who was one of the people in our slideshow there, who her family was dispossessed of property on Salt Spring Island, the Moore County family. Her sister Rose is still there. I mean, Mary remembers these events and tells the story of her dad being dragged away from their family home in Salt Spring in a way that, I mean, she's just a kind of remarkable, powerful storyteller conveying a really important history. The whole time I've been working on this, I've been surrounded by those kinds of storytellers. But I do know also that I hear that a lot also from Japanese Canadians.
Jordan, just add that there's a grief aspect that for those of us who have not yet been able to tell the story or even just hear other Japanese Canadian stories. So it's you're touching something that's very, very sensitive.
Yeah.
So I think there's more there to share. So I think this is a great start. And I really like the thought of exposing that everything. So it's a start.
Jordan, can you elaborate not only with Mary, but also Vivian and Bob? Hello.
Yeah. So that's an instance that Mike's talking to, where our project did encounter one of these silences. I guess we have So our community council members are connected with our project in general, but also with specific areas of activity. So my colleague at the University of Alberta, Eric Adams, and I were writing this piece on the Japanese-Canadian legal challenge to the dispossession. So in 1943, as soon as the properties start to are slated for sale, Japanese Canadians launch a legal challenge that goes to a federal court that no longer exists, but the Exchequer Court at the time, and they present three Japanese Canadians as the key litigants in the case. That case, really, the judge should have recused himself. He was just formally, almost momentarily ago, a member of the War Cabinet, who's a colleague to the people passing these laws, but Judge Schorson stays on. Spends 4 years contemplating the case during which all of Japanese Canadians' property is sold, and then in 1947 dismisses the case on technicality. So our project is working with the records of that case, which were actually, when we started our project, were sealed at LAC. No one had worked with people had seen the decision, but no one had worked with the internal records of the case. They were sealed due to vermin infestation. So we pressed Library Archives Canada on this, and they did whatever fumigating they needed to do, and we got the records. And so we wrote, Eric and I wrote a lengthy article in the Osgoode Hall Law Journal, and we circulated it to our community council member who was connected with my cluster, the kind of government records cluster, just because we were just circulating the draft, as we were working on it, just circulating the draft. And Vivian read the first page of our paper and just was stopped in her tracks and couldn't continue because she was pretty sure that one of the litigants was her dad. And she had never heard that her father had been involved in a legal challenge to the dispossession. She didn't know that her father had been an activist at all, and she took it to her mom, and her mom said, yeah, he was away for a while in Ottawa. And so, so certainly that's an instance of our project encountering one of these silences. And it's balanced for me by the fact that Vivian herself is such a force for telling this history. But yeah, we certainly encountered those in our project. Maybe I'll take one or two more questions, and then I'll be right out here to answer questions as well. I see you, sir.
And you can wait till after the break answers if you want, but what important distinction would you make between on the one hand, the internment of Italians in Ontario, and on the other hand, what the Nazis did apart from the death chambers in Germany?
The first, in some senses, it's a complicated question. This distinction from Germans and Italians in Canada is that was the first part of your question, right? German and Italian internments in Canada. Yeah. So that's pretty straightforward in a sense, where a little less than 1,000 Japanese Canadians, most of them Japanese nationals, although or a good portion of them Japanese nationals, but others were people who had resisted the policy of the uprooting. But if we leave aside, even in minor ways of protested, but if we leave aside and we take those Japanese nationals who were suspected of enemy interest, so the government had some specific suspicion against them of connection to an enemy belligerent country. So let's say about 500 people were interned or incarcerated in Ontario at the prisoner of war camps there, alongside folks like Italians and Germans. So these are foreign nationals of an enemy belligerent country, a subset of foreign nationals of whom there's some suspected enemy interest. If that's all Canada had done with regards to Japanese Canadians, then our treatment of Japanese Canadians would have been something like how we approached Italians and Germans. But the whole rest of the internment, the uprooting and internment of over 20,000 Canadians, of whom and Japanese nationals of whom there was no suspected enemy interest, that's entirely unlike our treatment of, say, people. I mean, imagine the internment in 1942 of people of German racial origin. So every person in Canada could be imagined to have some ancestral connection to Germany, right? Or even Italian. With regards to the death camps, I mean, the most I can say about that, I think, sensibly, is one of the things that I've been interested in, and I have an article, I have a chapter that's in one of these long gestating academic endeavors, but it seems to be coming out soon now. We seem to be getting to tonight. One of the things I've been interested in is that Canadians at the time talk a lot about Nazis. So Canadian officials talk about how their policies aren't like Nazi policies. The Japanese Canadians, some of them in their protest letters that we have outside, liken Canadian policies to Nazi policies. In the immediate post-war era, when popular opinion shifts, almost, the 1940s are really interesting. 1944. There's auctions and sales of property in Vancouver, no one's saying anything. 1946, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, all these papers, Winnipeg Free Press, are running articles calling those policies Nazi policies. So one of the things I've been interested in is the way in which people at the time were comparing what was happening in Canada to what was going on under the Nazis in Europe. And to me, those comparisons at the time kind of cut in two fashions. One was to point towards the similarity, so mass race-based policy, naming and targeting people in that way. And on the other hand, all of those references to Nazis in the 1940s in Canada were also serving to drive it, to make a distinction, to suggest that Canada can't be like Nazi Germany. So when Japanese Canadians wrote to officials and say, you're being like Nazis, what is this, Nazi Germany? They were both drawing the policy toward suggesting its similarity to Nazi Germany and making a distinction, saying Canada can't be Nazi Germany, and therefore you shouldn't be selling my property. And I think probably that that's probably a useful way to think about that comparison, about the ways in which those policies can draw together in our conception, and the way in which they're very different. There was no Japanese Canadians were murdered by the Canadian state in the 1940s. I think I'll take the other questions. I see other questions. I think I'll take the other ones just out here. I'll be right there. Mike has me stationed at the station out there. Sure, comment.